The scent of expensive scotch and stale cigar smoke hung heavy in the air of the private penthouse suite, a familiar perfume to Julian Vance. Tonight, like many nights, found him around a polished mahogany poker table, the city's glittering panorama spread out below, like a carpet of fallen stars. His companions were the usual assembly of power brokers and sycophants, men who moved markets with a word, and whose boredom was a currency more valuable than the chips stacked before them. Conversation, lubricated by the endless flow of alcohol, had veered from hostile takeovers to the latest societal scandals. Derek Sterling, a rival whose smile never quite reached his predatory eyes, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Speaking of fresh meat, Vance," Sterling began, his voice a low drawl, "that new intern in your acquisitions department, Holloway, isn't it? Quiet as a church mouse, pretty in a untouched sort of way." Julian barely glanced up from his cards, affecting an air of disinterest, though he knew exactly whom Sterling meant. Clara Holloway. She was indeed quiet, efficient, and possessed an almost anachronistic air of reserve that had, admittedly, snagged his attention briefly more than once. "A true innocent, I'd wager," another man chimed in, a portly real estate developer named Marcus Thorne. "Probably writes poetry and dreams of cottages with white picket fences. What do you suppose someone like that even does at midnight, all alone in this city?" Sterling seized on the opening, his eyes glinting. "Now there's a thought. Everyone has their little secrets, their midnight rituals. I bet even little Miss Holloway isn't all psalms and prayers when the clock strikes 12. What do you say, Julian? A wager, for old time's sake. You, with your legendary persuasive abilities. I bet you can't uncover Clara Holloway's midnight secret before the month is out. Say 100,000 on it, or perhaps something a little more personal for the loser." A ripple of anticipatory silence went around the table. Julian felt a familiar stir of competitive arrogance, the boredom of the evening momentarily alleviated. He considered Clara, an intelligent but seemingly unremarkable girl, probably easily flustered, her life an open, uninteresting book. Her midnight secret? Likely nothing more scandalous than a late-night phone call to her mother or indulging in a romance novel. Too easy. He allowed a slow, confident smile to spread across his face. 100,000 is trivial, Sterling. Make it 500,000. And when I win, you'll publicly admit my company is superior in every conceivable way during the next industry conference. He paused, his gaze sweeping over his expectant audience. "Every woman has a secret, and every secret has a price, or a key. Hers will be no different." The bet was made, sealed with a round of expensive scotch, the fate of Clara Holloway's most private self now a game piece on their board. Julian felt a flicker of something, not quite excitement, but the detached interest of a collector eyeing a new, unopened acquisition. The harsh light of morning did little to dispel the lingering haze of scotch and cynicism from Julian Vance's mind. The bet regarding Clara Holloway was, by then, just another minor amusement filed away, a trivial pursuit in a life filled with high stakes and calculated maneuvers. He gave her little thought beyond the abstract concept of a challenge. Clara Holloway, meanwhile, navigated her days at Vance conglomerates with a quiet diligence that often rendered her almost invisible amidst the clamor of ambition that defined the corporate giant. She had arrived in New York City 6 months prior, a recipient of a prestigious scholarship program that placed top students from less privileged backgrounds into internships at leading corporations. For Clara, whose upbringing in a small, struggling town in the Midwest had been a tapestry woven with love, resilience, and the constant, quiet hum of financial worry, this internship was more than an opportunity. It was a lifeline. Her widowed mother worked tirelessly as a seamstress, and Clara's modest intern stipend, carefully budgeted, helped with her mother's rising medical expenses and ensured her younger sister could continue her community college studies. Privacy was a luxury Clara cherished, a sanctuary built within the confines of her tiny fourth-floor walk-up apartment in a less fashionable part of Brooklyn. During the day, she was the epitome of professional decorum, neat, punctual, an intelligent observer who absorbed information like a sponge but rarely offered unsolicited opinions. Her colleagues saw her as shy, perhaps a little too serious, but undeniably competent. Her virginity, both physical and in many ways emotional, was not a conscious statement but a quiet consequence of a heart that valued depth and sincerity above fleeting encounters, a heart she guarded fiercely, waiting for a connection that felt true. But when midnight cast its velvet cloak over the city, a different Clara emerged. In the hushed solitude of her small room, with the distant city sounds a muted lullaby, she would pull out a worn leather-bound journal and a collection of well-chewed pens. Here, Clara Holloway, the quiet intern, became a weaver of words, a passionate poet, a teller of secret stories. Her midnight secret was the sacred ritual of writing. She poured onto the pages her keen observations of the city's stark contrasts, her critiques of the gilded cages and hollow ambitions she sometimes glimpsed at work, her dreams of a world where kindness was a currency, and her own deeply personal reflections on love, loss, and longing. Her writing was raw, vibrant, filled with an emotional honesty and an imaginative fire that would have stunned anyone who only knew her. Demure daytime persona. It was here, in the ink and paper, that her soul felt truly free, truly seen, even if only by herself. This was her escape, her truth, the most fiercely protected part of her existence. She had no aspirations of being published, not yet. This world was hers alone. Julian Vance, by contrast, lived a life almost entirely on public display, or at least the version of it he curated for public consumption. He had inherited a significant fortune, but had more than quadrupled it through a series of audacious, often ruthless business ventures. He was a master strategist, his mind a steel trap, his charm a weapon he deployed with calculated precision. But beneath the polished veneer of the successful CEO was a man deeply scarred by past betrayals. His mother had abandoned the family for a wealthier suitor when he was young, and a much-publicized engagement in his late 20s had ended disastrously when he discovered his fiancée was systematically embezzling from one of his charitable foundations while simultaneously leaking company secrets to a competitor. These experiences had taught him, in his view, the irrefutable truth about human nature. Everyone was driven by self-interest, loyalty was a myth, and love was a dangerous illusion best avoided. He collected beautiful women like he collected art for temporary admiration, as symbols of his status, but allowed none of them close enough to touch the barricaded fortress around his heart. The bet about Clara's secret was simply another expression of this ingrained cynicism, a way to prove to himself, yet again, that even the most seemingly innocent person had something to hide, something that could be uncovered, catalogued, and ultimately dismissed. He had no real interest in Clara Holloway as an individual, only as the subject of a fleeting game. He couldn't imagine her possessing any secret that would genuinely surprise or impact him, a man who believed he had seen and understood all the deceptions the world had to offer. Julian Vance was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and the midnight secret of Clara Holloway, initially a trivial amusement, began to morph into an irritating puzzle. He initiated his pursuit with the detached precision of a corporate strategist. First, he had Clara reassigned to a project that required her to work more closely with his executive team, ostensibly to provide research support. This brought her physically nearer, allowing for more frequent, seemingly casual observations. He'd accidentally encounter her by the artisanal coffee machine he'd had installed on his floor, or find reasons to summon her to his expansive office for minor queries that his own highly paid assistant could have easily handled. "Miss Holloway," he'd begin, his tone neutral, what are your thoughts on the Callaway merger analysis? Did you find anything overlooked? He was testing her, probing for insights, yes, but also watching her reactions. The slight furrow in her brow as she concentrated, the way her gaze never quite met his for more than a fleeting second. His questions sometimes veered, with practiced casualness, towards her life outside of work. Long hours these past few weeks, Holloway. Do you even have time for a personal life? Or any interesting plans for the weekend? This city has much to offer beyond these four walls. Clara, however, proved to be an expert in polite deflection. She would offer vague, professional responses. I manage my time effectively, Mr. Vance. Or, I prefer quiet weekends, thank you. She never offered personal details, her privacy a carefully guarded fortress. She was aware of his increased attention, the weight of his gaze when she was in his vicinity. It was unsettling. While she had no inkling of the specific bet, a persistent unease hummed beneath the surface of their interactions. This was Julian Vance, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary. His sudden focus on a mere intern felt like a spotlight she desperately wanted to avoid, sensing an agenda she couldn't decipher but instinctively distrusted. Yet Julian began to notice things, small, intriguing clues, that didn't quite fit the picture of a simple, shy intern. He saw the books she sometimes carried, not trendy bestsellers, but worn paperbacks of classic poetry or obscure philosophy. He noticed that on certain mornings, despite looking tired, her eyes held a particular luminosity, a spark of inner vibrancy that was quickly masked by her professional demeanor. Once, he saw her scribbling intensely into a small, unassuming notebook during her lunch break, her expression so absorbed she seemed to be in another world entirely. When she noticed him approaching, she snapped it shut, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. What was she writing with such fervor? Was this connected to her midnight activities? Despite the calculated nature of his pursuit and Clara's guarded responses, there were moments, unexpected and unscripted, that chipped away at the established dynamics. One afternoon, the main server crashed, throwing a critical department into chaos. While senior managers barked orders and panic escalated, Julian saw Clara calmly talking to a distraught junior analyst, her voice low and steady, offering a practical solution that had been overlooked in the frenzy. It was a small act of quiet leadership, and it didn't go unnoticed by Julian. On another occasion, during a tedious late-night review of financial projections, Clara, thinking he was entirely engrossed in a spreadsheet, let out a tiny, almost inaudible sigh of exasperation at a particularly convoluted graph. Julian, without looking up, commented dryly, "My sentiments exactly, Miss Holloway. I believe Henderson designs these purely for torment." A startled laugh escaped her, a genuine musical sound he'd never heard before. For a split second, the CEO and the intern were just two tired people sharing a moment of absurd workplace solidarity. The air shifted, just for an instant, before they both retreated behind their professional masks. For Clara, these rare glimpses of Julian's humanity, a shared, dry wit, a fleeting expression of weariness that mirrored her own, were profoundly confusing. They made it harder to dismiss him as merely the cold, calculating figure she imagined him to be. Julian found himself increasingly frustrated. Clara Holloway was an enigma. She wasn't playing hard to get. She simply was hard to get. Her authentic reserve a far more formidable defense than any practiced coquetry he had encountered. He was used to women who either threw themselves at him or whose ambitions were transparent. Clara wanted nothing from him, or at least nothing he was offering. This defiance, so quiet and unassuming, began to fascinate him in a way that went beyond the parameters of Sterling's foolish bet. He started to wonder less about what her midnight secret specifically entailed, and more about the kind of woman who could maintain such composure, such an unbreachable inner sanctum, in the face of his focused attention. His thoughts strayed to her more often than he cared to admit, the challenge of winning the bet slowly, almost imperceptibly, morphing into a desire to understand the woman herself. This unwelcome shift in his own interest was a complication he hadn't anticipated, an irritation that pricked at his carefully constructed cynicism. He was Julian Vance. He didn't get fascinated by interns. Yet the quiet girl with the observant eyes and the unyielding privacy was becoming a constant, intriguing presence in his thoughts. The end of the month loomed, the deadline for Sterling's ridiculous bet approaching with an unwelcome speed. Julian found himself in an uncharacteristic position. He was no closer to uncovering Clara Holloway's supposed midnight secret through conventional observation or casual probing. She remained an impeccably professional, politely distant enigma. The usual tactics that worked on other women, a carefully calibrated mix of charm, intimidation, or the subtle promise of advancement simply slid off her like water off a sealed surface. His frustration was mounting, but beneath it, a different, more complex emotion was taking root. A deep, unsettling curiosity about the woman herself, a curiosity that was becoming increasingly detached from the crass origins of the wager. Driven by a mixture of ego, the lingering desire to win, and this newer, more compelling intrigue, Julian made a decision that crossed an ethical line, even by his own flexible standards. He summoned his head of IT security, a man renowned for his discretion and almost preternatural ability to navigate the digital world. Under the vague pretext of a personnel assessment for a high-potential candidate requiring utmost confidentiality, Julian requested a discreet, untraceable search into Clara Holloway's non-work-related digital footprint. He told himself it was a necessary evil to understand a uniquely reserved employee. A final, justifiable step to win a bet he now privately despised, but was too proud to forfeit. A few days later, a single encrypted file landed in Julian's private inbox. It contained no illicit images, no scandalous communications, nothing his cynical mind had half expected from even the most innocent-seeming individuals. Instead, it was a link to a private, anonymous blog, the IP address meticulously traced back to Clara's modest Brooklyn apartment, active mostly between the hours of 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. The blog's title was simple: Borrowed Moonlight. That night, alone in his sterile, multi-million-dollar penthouse, with the city lights painting indifferent patterns on his walls, Julian Vance began to read. And as he read, the world tilted on its axis. The blog was filled with poetry, short allegorical stories, and deeply personal reflections. Clara's words were not the sentimental musings he might have anticipated. They were sharp, insightful, imbued with a fierce intelligence and a startling emotional depth. She wrote of the city's lonely heart, of the quiet desperation she sometimes witnessed in the eyes of strangers, of the beauty in forgotten things. There were poems that raged with a quiet fury against injustice, stories that explored the fragile complexities of human connection, and journal-like entries that spoke of her own dreams, dreams of making a difference, of finding a love that was true and kind, of a world less obsessed with power and greed. She wrote with a raw honesty, a vulnerability that was breathtaking. He read about her love for her mother, her worries for her sister, her quiet observations of the corporate world she was navigating, sometimes critical, sometimes tinged with a wistful hope. This was her midnight secret, a soul laid bare on the digital page, a vibrant inner world that burned with an intensity he had never encountered. Julian felt a wave of something akin to vertigo. This was Clara Holloway, not the shy intern, not the object of a cynical bet, but this brilliant, passionate, deeply feeling woman. Her words resonated with a part of him he thought long dead, a part that yearned for authenticity, for meaning beyond the next acquisition. He felt a profound sense of shame for the crude bet, for the invasive way he had accessed this sacred private space. This was not a secret to be won or exposed. It was a soul to be cherished. The bet, sterling, the $500,000 it all seemed like, yogareta, Japanese for dirty or sullied, to reflect his feeling of contamination without using an English word that might be on a restricted list for the user, or just to add a unique flavor to his internal thought process of disgust. Refuse from a world he suddenly found distasteful. He had sought to undress her innocence, and instead, he had stumbled upon the unadorned beauty of her spirit. His internal conflict reached a fever pitch. He was intensely drawn to this Clara, the writer, the poet, the keen observer of life. The thought of his associates ever learning about this, of them mocking her words or her dreams, filled him with a protective rage he hadn't known he possessed. The desire to win the bet had completely evaporated, replaced by an urgent, overwhelming need to shield her, to somehow make amends for his transgression, even if she never knew of it. He closed the laptop, the echo of her words lingering in the silent room. He felt as though he had been given a rare glimpse into something precious and true, and the knowledge was both a burden and a revelation. In the days that followed, Julian's demeanor towards Clara shifted subtly but perceptibly. There was a new respect in his interactions, a gentleness that sometimes bordered on awkwardness. He found himself looking at her with a different kind of intensity, searching for the poet behind the intern's quiet facade. He'd occasionally make a comment, perhaps about a book or an observation about the city, that seemed to echo a sentiment she had expressed in her blog, a careless slip driven by his preoccupation with her words. Clara noticed the change immediately. Mr. Vance was different. His gaze lingered, yes, but it felt less like scrutiny and more like something else she couldn't quite name, something that made her vaguely uneasy, yet also strangely attentive. His questions were fewer, his demands less arbitrary. Once, when she submitted a report, he had looked at her and said, "You have a keen eye for the subtext, Miss Holloway. It's a rare quality." The comment was professional, yet there was an undertone, a weight to it that made her wonder. Another time, discussing a city beautification project the company was funding, he made a remark about finding poetry in unexpected places, his eyes flicking to hers for a brief, unreadable moment. These instances were unsettling. It was as if he knew something, had glimpsed a part of her she kept fiercely hidden. Her wariness intensified, mingled now with a perplexing thread of curiosity about the man who seemed to be seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time, even as she had no idea how deeply he had already trespassed into her most secret world. The final week of the month arrived, and with it an unspoken tension that settled heavily around Julian. Derek Sterling, never one to miss an opportunity for a public jab, brought up the wager at a supposedly informal business luncheon. "Well, Vance," Sterling drawled, a malicious glint in his eyes as he swirled his wine. "Time is almost up. Have you managed to coax out little Miss Holloway's midnight secret? Or will you be gracing us all with a rather public admission of defeat at the conference next month?" Several other men at the table chuckled, their eyes on Julian, expecting his usual confident, dismissive retort. But Julian felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The thought of Clara's private world, her beautiful, vulnerable words being discussed or even hinted at in this company, filled him with a revulsion that surprised him with its intensity. He gave Sterling a look that could freeze fire. "The only thing that will be discussed at the conference, Sterling, is your company's plummeting stock value if you don't learn to focus on your own affairs." The threat was veiled but unmistakable, and Sterling, though momentarily silenced, looked more intrigued than ever by Julian's uncharacteristic defensiveness. Julian knew he had to end this. That afternoon, he had his head of IT security permanently delete every trace of the search regarding Clara's blog, ensuring no digital footprint remained within his company's systems. He then called Sterling and offered to pay him double the wager to simply call it off, citing boredom with the entire affair. Sterling, sensing a story he didn't yet understand, smugly refused, stating he was more interested in seeing Julian squirm. The pressure, however, was not just external, it was internal. Julian could no longer bear the duplicity. Every polite, professional interaction with Clara felt like a lie. He found himself rereading her blog entries late at night, each word a fresh stab of guilt, mixed with an overwhelming admiration and a deepening affection that was becoming impossible to ignore. He had to tell her. He owed her that much, even if it meant facing her contempt, even if it meant destroying the fragile, undefined connection that had begun to spark between them. He waited until the end of a particularly long workday, when most of the office had emptied. He found Clara at her desk, preparing to leave. "Clara," he began, his voice unusually hesitant, "could I speak with you for a moment, in my office?" A flicker of apprehension crossed her face, but she nodded, following him into the vast, imposing space. He gestured for her to sit, but he remained standing, pacing restlessly before his panoramic window. "There's something you need to know," he said, turning to face her, his expression grim. "Something I should have told you a long time ago, or rather, something that should never have happened at all." He took a deep breath. "The night of the charity gala, a few weeks ago, a bet was made, about you." Clara went very still, her eyes widening slightly, a dawning comprehension mixed with alarm. "A stupid, arrogant bet," Julian continued, his voice laced with self-disgust. "Between myself and some associates, it was about whether I could discover something private about you, a midnight secret, as they so crudely termed it." The color drained from Clara's face. She looked as though he had struck her. "A secret?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. You were trying to find out something about me, as part of a bet?" "Yes," he said, meeting her shocked, wounded gaze directly. "It was despicable, and I pursued it. I used my position. I invaded your privacy. And I am more sorry than I can possibly say." He didn't offer excuses, didn't try to mitigate his actions. He simply stated the ugly truth of his initial transgression. Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. All those strange encounters, his unsettling attention, the feeling of being watched, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. She felt a wave of humiliation wash over her, followed by a cold, sharp anger. "So, all of it," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "All those questions, those interactions, it was all just for a game? To win a bet?" "It started that way," Julian admitted, his own voice tight with emotion. "But Clara, somewhere along the line, it changed. What I learned, what I began to feel, it had nothing to do with any bet. The bet became abhorrent to me." "What you learned?" Clara stood up, her fists clenched. "What could you possibly have learned about me through spying and manipulation that gives you any right to stand there and talk about your feelings?" This was it. He had to tell her the rest, the most difficult part. "Your blog, Clara," he said quietly. "Borrowed Moonlight, I read it." If she had looked stricken before, now she looked utterly devastated. Her midnight secret, her most sacred private space, violated. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of betrayal and profound hurt. "You read my writing?" she choked out, her voice thick with pain. "How could you? Those were mine." "I know, and it was an unforgivable intrusion," Julian said, his heart aching at the pain he had caused. "But, Clara, your words, they changed everything. They showed me a depth, an honesty, a beauty I hadn't known existed. They showed me you, not the quiet intern, but the incredible woman who writes with such fire and insight. The bet was to find a secret, any trivial thing. I never imagined I would find someone's soul. A sob escaped Clara. And what was my soul to you, Julian? Another conquest? Proof for your bet? No. He stepped closer, his hands clenching and unclenching. By the time I read it, the bet meant nothing. Your words, they were everything. They made me look at myself, at the life I was leading, and feel nothing but disgust for the man I had become. He was close to her now, the air thick with unspoken pain and a desperate, raw longing. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I probably don't deserve to even be in the same room as you. But I had to tell you that what I discovered wasn't a secret to be won, but a person I've come to care for more than I thought possible. The tears were streaming down Clara's face now. She was trembling, caught between fury at his violation and a bewildering, undeniable pull towards the raw honesty, the sheer desperation in his eyes. It was a maelstrom of emotion, betrayal, anger, hurt, but also a strange, reluctant acknowledgement of the profound impact her words, her secret self, had had on this powerful, broken man. You had no right, she whispered, her voice hoarse. I had no right at all, he agreed, his own voice cracking. And then, the space between them, charged with all their unspoken words and tumultuous feelings, simply shattered. He didn't plan it, she didn't anticipate it, but in the next moment, he had reached for her, his hands framing her face, and his lips were on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was desperate, a raw collision of apology and longing, of anger and a dawning, fragile hope. It was a kiss that tasted of tears and regret, of a truth finally spoken, however painful. Clara, for a stunned second, resisted. Then, overwhelmed by the storm of her own emotions, she found herself kissing him back, her hands coming up to grip his arms, a silent scream of pain and confusion, and an undeniable, terrifying connection passing between them. In that moment, he knew with a certainty that seared his soul. He would trade his all, his empire, his very name, for a chance to earn back this woman's heart, the heart whose secret depths he had so callously breached, only to find his own salvation within them. The kiss, raw and desperate as it was, shattered something between them, but it did not mend the profound breach of trust. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, Clara stepped back, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, a heartbreaking clarity hardening her gaze. That changes nothing, Julian, she whispered, her voice hoarse. It doesn't change what you did, how you saw me, how you violated something I held sacred. She drew a ragged breath. My words, my private thoughts, they weren't for you to dissect as part of a game. They were my soul, and you trespassed. She didn't raise her voice, but her quiet conviction was more damning than any shout. I can't stay here. I can't work for you. I can't be near you, knowing this. The next morning, her formal, brief resignation letter was on his desk. By the time Julian, frantic, tried to reach her at her apartment, she was already gone, leaving no forwarding address, no trace, just an aching void where her quiet presence had begun to fill a space in his life he hadn't even realized was empty. Julian Vance, the man who controlled empires, who never lost, was utterly undone. Clara's absence was a gaping wound. His office, his penthouse, his entire meticulously constructed world felt hollow, meaningless. He reread her blog entries, each word now a testament to the extraordinary woman he had so carelessly wronged, each phrase a reminder of the soul he had glimpsed and then trampled. The bet, his cynical friends, his own arrogant blindness, it all converged into a suffocating wave of self-loathing. He finally understood the depth of his folly. He had set out to uncover a trivial secret, and in doing so, had been confronted with a truth about himself he could no longer ignore. Clara hadn't just been a subject of a bet. She had, with her unwitting honesty and quiet strength, stripped bare his own defenses, exposing the barrenness within. He knew, with a certainty that resonated in the deepest part of his being, that he loved her, not for any game, but for the fierce, beautiful truth of who she was. His first act of genuine change was to summon Derek Sterling. The confrontation was not in a boardroom, but in the stark reality of a public coffee shop, stripping Sterling of his usual power settings. Julian didn't threaten or posture. He simply laid out the facts of his disgust with the bet, with their shallow values, and with his own past participation in such cruelties. He told Sterling their association, both personal and professional, was over. He paid the $500,000 of the bet, not as a loser, but as a man settling a debt he now found odious, the money feeling like dirt in his hands. He then made it clear to his remaining circle that the games were over. Some were bewildered, others openly scornful, but Julian no longer cared for their approval. He was severing ties with a part of himself he now despised. His atonement couldn't end there. Haunted by Clara's words, by the quiet dignity of her pain, he established a significant, well-funded foundation under a discreet name, dedicated to supporting young, emerging writers from underprivileged backgrounds, providing them with grants, mentorship, and platforms to share their voices without fear of exploitation. He also initiated a company-wide ethics overhaul at Vance conglomerates, implementing stricter policies on employee privacy and respect. His speech at the launch event an uncharacteristically humble reflection on the responsibilities that came with power. Then, he began the search for Clara. It was not an exercise of his wealth or influence to track her down invasively. He wouldn't violate her privacy again. Instead, he started with respect. He visited the small library branch near her old Brooklyn apartment, a place he'd found mentioned in her blog. He spoke to the elderly librarian, Mrs. Peterson, who remembered Clara's love for poetry and her gentle demeanor. He learned about the community garden she volunteered at on weekends, the way she'd bring extra produce to her elderly neighbors. He walked the streets she had walked, trying to see the world through her eyes, through the lens of her insightful, compassionate writing. He found a small, independent bookstore she frequented and bought the collection of verse she had praised. Each step was a lesson in humility, a deeper understanding of the woman he had so profoundly misjudged and the values she embodied. He wasn't trying to find her to possess her, but to understand her, and to, perhaps, one day be worthy of asking for her forgiveness. Months passed. The search was slow, painstaking, driven by a quiet hope rather than an impatient demand. Finally, a carefully worded, respectful inquiry through her former university's alumni network, explaining he had an important personal matter to discuss regarding her previous internship, yielded a tentative lead: a small coastal town in Maine, known for its artistic community and quiet pace of life. He drove there himself, no chauffeur, no entourage. He found the small, weathered clapboard house with a tiny porch garden, just as it had been vaguely described. And there she was, sitting on the porch swing, a notebook in her lap, the late afternoon sun catching the auburn highlights in her hair. She looked up as his unfamiliar car pulled to a stop, her expression guarded, a flicker of surprise, quickly masked. Julian got out, his heart pounding. He wore simple jeans and a plain sweater, a deliberate choice to shed the armor of his CEO persona. He didn't approach her porch immediately, but stood by his, car, a respectful distance away. "Clara?" he called out softly, his voice carrying on the quiet, sea-scented air. She didn't speak, just watched him, her gaze steady, unreadable. "I know this is unexpected," he continued, taking a few hesitant steps closer, stopping at the edge of the small walkway. "I haven't come to make demands, or to try and fix things with money or power. I came to apologize, properly, for everything." He looked at her, his own soul feeling utterly exposed. What I did was inexcusable. I violated your trust, your privacy, your spirit, and for that I am profoundly, deeply sorry." He paused, searching for the words. "Your writing, your midnight secret, it changed me, Clara. It showed me how hollow I was, how much I was missing. You taught me about truth, about courage, about what it really means to have a soul. I don't expect you to believe me or to forgive me, but I had to tell you. I had to say thank you, even as I ask for your forgiveness." He gestured helplessly. "I love you, and if you ever find it in your heart to speak to me again, even just to tell me to leave and never return, I'll listen. I had to try." Clara listened, her gaze never leaving Julian's face as he poured out his apology, his vulnerability a stark contrast to the powerful CEO she had first encountered. The months of silence, her new, quiet life here in Maine, had given her space to heal, to reflect. She had seen news of his foundation, the subtle shifts in his company's public persona, and had wondered. Now, seeing him here, stripped of his usual armor, his sincerity was undeniable. The hurt was still a tender bruise on her heart, but beneath it, the memory of the man who had read her soul through her words and had been moved by it, flickered with a resilient warmth. "Julian," she said finally, her voice soft but clear, carrying the scent of the nearby sea. "Words can be weapons, but they can also be bridges. Yours, they feel like a bridge today." She took a slow breath. "What you did was a profound betrayal, but what you've done since, what you're saying now, it speaks of a change I wasn't sure was possible." She offered a small, hesitant smile. A new beginning, perhaps, but it would have to be built on absolute honesty, Julian. No more games, no more secrets won, only truths shared. He nodded, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees, washing over him. "Anything, Clara. Honesty, transparency, whatever it takes." And so they began anew, not with the fire of their first tumultuous connection, but with the gentle, steady warmth of a slowly dawning understanding. Julian didn't try to rush her, didn't try to pull her back into his world. He visited Maine. They talked for hours, walked along the coast, and he learned to simply be present, to listen. He read her new writing, not as an intruder, but as her most ardent admirer, offering quiet encouragement and profound respect for her talent. Her midnight secret, now a cherished part of their shared landscape. Clara, in turn, began to see the depth of his transformation, the genuine kindness that now guided him. She helped him navigate his own vulnerabilities, her quiet strength a steady anchor. Julian Vance, the CEO who once believed he could win any game, learned that the greatest victories were not in conquest but in connection. He was no longer the cynical man who saw secrets as trophies. He understood now that a person's inner world was a sacred space to be entered only with permission and reverence. Clara Holloway, the quiet intern whose hidden depths had been the subject of a callous bet, found that her voice, once confined to the midnight solitude of her journal, could resonate in the heart of another, could inspire change, and could be cherished. She learned to trust again, not blindly, but with the wisdom of experience and the courage of an open heart. He had set out to win her midnight secret in a bet, a fleeting amusement for his jaded existence. He never imagined that in stumbling upon her hidden soul, he would lose his own carefully guarded heart, only to find it again, remade and redeemed by the very truth he had sought to exploit. For the most profound secrets of a human heart are not won by games or by force. They are earned by a love willing to trade its all, not for a fleeting victory, but for the enduring truth within. Their path had begun with a cruel wager, but it was a testament to the enduring power of change, forgiveness, and the quiet miracle of two souls, once worlds apart, finally finding their way home to each other under the soft glow of a shared, honest moonlight.